Catherine Baer, Director of Science and Policy at the River Network, and welcome to today's webinar. I think many of you have been with us on our first two webinars, and so thanks for joining this series. And if you haven't been on our first two webinars are available on our YouTube page, which I will provide that link later in the webinar. So it's 1 o'clock now. We're going to go ahead and get started. We got some people coming in, but that's okay. We've got a lot to cover today, and Stacey is super excited, and it's got a really great presentation today. So let me give a short introduction on behalf of River Network, and then before I hand it over to Stacey to get started. So first of all, River Network, as most of you know, we're a national nonprofit organization, and we really work to connect people working on water issues around the country. We've helped build the capacity of many local groups to become more effective in protecting their rivers and drinking waters across the country to make sure we've got healthier rivers across the United States. And we do that through our programming and science, policy, and leadership development, and through our conferences, convenings, trainings like this one, as well as our annual conference River Rally and a number of policy initiatives across the country. So find more about us on our website, and thanks to those of you who are River Network members. So at River Network, you know, like many of you, we work on a number of water issues, but over the last couple of years, we have come to have a focus on drinking water. And this is something that, you know, probably I'd say 5 or 10 years ago, a lot of the groups who maybe had been working mostly on clean water and recreation issues were less familiar with drinking water. And so it was the same for us at River Network. And so we've really been on a journey to learn about drinking water. It's recognizing its importance, the crises, and really that, you know, people touch drinking water on a daily basis in a way that not everyone does with, say, fishing or canoeing, which some of us love, but that's just not something that everyone touches all the time. So drinking water is critical for our health, economy, and really for water resource health around the country. So we decided to jump into this topic and really figure out how we could work to help build the capacity of groups around the country to work on drinking water in a meaningful way. And so as we looked at what was out there and what wasn't out there, we recognized the needs for some basic training and materials on drinking water. And that's why we decided to publish just earlier this year our Drinking Water Guide, a resource for advocates. And this is a screenshot of it right there, and you can see the link where the guide is available online. And the Drinking Water Guide really provides resources, case studies, and some overview information on how drinking water works. And the sections are reflective of what we heard from our network and people around the country of, you know, what their questions were about drinking water. So it really starts with, how do we protect our drinking water? Where does it come from? What does my drinking water system do? What are the frameworks and policies in place? And ends with a section on community action and advocacy, which is woven through the guide, but really thinks about this and also tries to get at some of the issues of equity in drinking water that are so prevalent around the country in terms of some of the impacts we see. So I hope you'll check out the guide and send us any comments as we look for updates and revisions and how we might want to use that better as we continue to roll it out. So this webinar is really part of that series of providing a deeper dive into some of the topics. Now, the section 4 was called, What Does Drinking Water Cost and What Is My Water Bill Paying For? And this topic has received a lot of attention and energy as we've gone around and made presentations about the guide, a lot of questions about how do you make sure the water is safe to drink, and that means more investment, but how do you also keep it affordable and make sure people don't have their water turned off so they actually are able to keep their houses and their children and make sure that water is affordable for everyone. So this is a really critical topic. The picture on the bottom right is one I took when I was on a tour with Monica Lewis-Patrick from We the People of Detroit, and that's their water distribution, where they're actually taking water out to people in the community because it's become unaffordable, or the water has been shut off in many places. So it's a serious issue, and I'm thrilled today that Stacey is going to provide us really an overview and background of the interaction between water rates and water affordability. And so let me hand it over to Stacey. So Stacey Isaac Berahzer is the founder of IBE Environmental, which is in Georgia. She's got over 16 years of experience in the environmental field, and she served as a senior project director with the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill before founding IBE Environmental. She's got strong expertise in water pricing, water services, as well as stormwater and watershed management. She's got an academic background in environmental science and public administration, and speaks Spanish, as well as spent time working in the Caribbean. In Georgia, she serves as the chair of the board of directors for the Institute for Georgia Environmental Leadership, and teaches for the Georgia Association of Water Professional Leadership Academy. So before I hand it over to Stacey, I'm just going to note to everyone that you can at any time put questions in the chat box. I'll be looking for that and in the question area, so please keep your eye on that, or if you have a question, type it in and I can stop Stacey during the webinar as needed. And also note that in the handouts, Stacey's slides that she will use today are available, so you can go there and download her presentation. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Stacey. So let me go ahead and make you the presenter.
Great. Thanks, Catherine and the River Network for hosting this webinar series. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm going to switch over here to my screen. Okay, so you should be seeing my screen now with the title of today's webinar. And as Catherine mentioned, I worked for many years with the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and they have some great resources, and a lot of what I'll be talking about today, I'll reference some of their free online resources. But yeah, IBE Environmental is almost a year old. A little bit about the organization. Water affordability and equity is really our main line of business. In terms of funding sources, though, a very specific project that we do is the Georgia Funders Forum, so facilitating a group of funders here in Georgia. And stormwater and watershed management is something, sort of green infrastructure, that we also work on. In all of these areas, it's really financial management and good stewardship of the resources, as well as good financial stewardship. And then I do have a background in Caribbean water issues, because I am from the Caribbean originally, and so have been working with some young people there, trying to get them to just engage in and enter the field of environmental careers, and been doing some work there, as well as over the last few years some work in Puerto Rico with small drinking water systems there. So that's in a nutshell what IBE Environmental is about. In terms of today's presentation, I'm going to give you guys some background. We're going to look at whether or not there's an affordability problem at a given water utility. And then if we do seem to find a problem, how do we address that? And there are a variety of things we should look at. And then last but not least is, if you do decide to develop some sort of customer assistance program or CAP, how do you fund a CAP? So if we think about these items here on the outline in terms of a process, sort of a flow chart starts to develop, right? So we start with trying to figure out the answer to this question: is there an affordability problem? And we try to answer that from a data perspective. So I'll show you a tool where you can answer that question using census data. If there's not a problem, up here, we see no. Really, no is probably better defined as not right now or not yet. Water and sewer rates have been rising sharply over the last several years, and they're projected to continue rising. So if a given utility does not have an affordability issue right now, that may change in the future. So it's a good thing to go back and redo this assessment that I'll show you from time to time. However, if there is an affordability problem that the data is revealing, then you probably need to look at designing a CAP or a customer assistance program. And in terms of how you do that, again, like the previous slide, there are several things that we should be looking at. The type of assistance: do we want to give plumbing efficiency and leak repair within a household, or do we want to do the assistance purely through the bill, giving low-income customers a discount? We can do both, of course. Who do we want to give the assistance to? How do we verify a customer's eligibility for an assistance program? And then outreach, I won't spend too much time on, but I will say it is critical. There are many programs that have been developed, they've been funded to assist low-income customers, and the outreach is sort of the weak link in the chain, and we don't reach the right customers and they don't sign up for the program. So that's kind of the flow chart of what we will be talking about today. Let's see. For some reason, I am not able to the next slide here. Okay. So a little bit of background. I want to start by saying that good operation and maintenance of any water, wastewater, or stormwater utility is key. If we have good O&M, we reduce the cost of running the utility, and therefore we don't have to have as many rate increases or as high of rate increases. So for example, if we have a regular schedule to replace lines across the system, we'll see an overall reduction in leaks. And on the water side and on the wastewater side, we'll see less what we call I&I in the industry, or infiltration and inflow. So part of this webinar series has been to kind of give you guys, as water advocates in your communities, more grassroots or nonprofit groups perhaps, the tools to work with and talk with the utility staff at your local water utility. And so I&I is a cool term to throw out there. It has to do with wastewater lines and water entering the lines from the surrounding area. And all of these things, if there are leaks, if there is I&I, it reduces, it wastes energy. And so again, the utility, one of the highest bills that a water utility has is this energy cost usually. And so anything that we can do to reduce energy use at the utility results in overall financial savings and therefore less need for rate increases. So not repairing or rehabilitating the assets of a water system on a regular schedule leads to earlier failure. And so the asset has a certain given useful life that the manufacturer would have provided. And so we don't get the full maximum useful life out of an asset if we don't repair and rehabilitate it on a regular schedule. So those are sort of best management practices overall. If a utility isn't doing these basic things, then it's really premature to start looking at customer assistance programs, I would say, unless we try to do them in tandem. Water efficiency and conservation is another example. I would say that overall, high water and sewer rates do encourage conservation, but of course they can leave low-income customers in a bad place. And so ideally we try to have rates that are set to what the utility really needs to cover its costs, and then find ways to address helping low-income customers at the same time. In terms of household conservation and efficiency, many customer assistance programs at different utilities do actually encourage and they provide efficiency and conservation services to their residential customers. Now, in the utility world, it's not the most comfortable thing for utility staff to be entering personal property. So you will have some utilities push back on that. Maybe your local ones would say, we don't want to go into people's premises, their personal premises. And that's sort of a government, public-private, you don't want to cross that threshold in some cases. So that lingers out there. But many utilities have crossed that sort of barrier or hurdle, and they do go on into private property. They have different ways of doing it. So this is an example here from Portland, and you'll see that leak and fixtures repair is one of their services. The city of Atlanta also provides this service, but it can be touchy. At this point, we'll make sure everybody is still engaged, and we have our first poll question, which is asking, does your water system currently provide assistance to low-income customers or customers who can't pay their water bills?
Okay, we've launched the poll, so people are voting right now. Does your system provide assistance? So far, still responses coming in, Stacey.
Okay.
So it looks like about, so this question, does your system provide assistance to customers who can't or don't pay their water bills? About 60% of folks said yes.
Okay.
About 16% said no, and about a quarter were not sure. So that's about on that one. So thanks to everyone who voted. I'm going to close that so you can see Stacey's screen again.
Great. Well, that's a good mixture. but 60% of the folks on the phone saying yes is pretty encouraging. But we'll talk about outreach as well, where about a quarter of you are saying you don't know if your water system actually provides that kind of program. So that definitely talks to, it implies that we can probably do better outreach on some of these programs. Okay, I want to clarify again, this is something that you should have clear in your minds when you're talking to water utility staff, especially like financial staff, right? The focus of the discussion today is on affordability from the customer perspective, at the customer level, not what we call financial capacity of the overall utility. Okay, so the American Water Works Association, I mentioned in each webinar so far in the series, they have a manual called M1, and it's really kind of considered the Bible of water rate setting in the industry. And so they define affordability as the inability, you can see it on your screen here, the inability of the poorest segments of the population or the customer base to fund its proportionate share of the total cost of the provision of utility services. So they're talking about low-income customers here. Financial capacity relates to the overall financial position of the utility, and it's not really the context for today's discussion. So something that comes up in some settings. So I've heard this question more, to be honest, on the nonprofit sort of grassroots end of things. It's not something that the water utilities are saying very much, but the question about, is there a difference between an affordable rate structure or affordable water rates and an assistance program? So we hear things like, or terms like handouts, and the question about how do handouts and assistance affect human dignity and people's, people's pride and their ability to take care of their families and, accept the assistance, for instance. So on that, Philadelphia's Tiered Assistance Program, or TAP, has been highly acclaimed as addressing affordability and not providing assistance. And so I'll give you a couple basic pointers about the assistance program. I'm sorry, the TAP program in Philly. First of all, it's one of a kind. It's the only kind of program like this that we have in the country, and so it gets a lot of attention, for a very big utility to embark on this. But it's innovative in that the monthly bills for customers are based on the income of the customer. And they have a range, 2 to 4% of the customer's total household income. So it's not that I'm low income and you're average or high income, and we use the same amount of water, we get the same bill, but then I get a discount off of my bill. So each of us gets an $80 bill, but then I only pay $60 because of my discount. That's the traditional model where we do have customer assistance programs. In the case with Philadelphia, we just each get different bills because of my low income status. So it's not a handout. It's not, I think, what some folks refer to in this setting as assistance. It's just some would say a more affordable bill. Now, another important thing here is that customers do not have to be delinquent or behind on their payments to enter the program. So again, there is more discussion about this concept from different types of groups and less from different types of groups. So I wanted to try something here, and I want to put it out to you guys. If you have thoughts on this idea of affordable water rates versus assistance programs, if you would go ahead and type those into the chat box, we'd see if we have some time to discuss it today as a group, or we can, at least kind of archive those and see what your thoughts are on that. It's pretty weird, but from time to time, I have trouble moving to the next slide. Catherine, I don't know if you did something the last time. Okay, it's moving now. So yeah, again, type in your thoughts. If you have specific thoughts on this particular topic or question of affordable water rates versus assistance programs, put those in, and we'll try to swing back around and take a look at that. Okay, This is sort of a transition. Now we're going to talk about why have customer assistance programs. So at this point, I will take a short break here. I'll pause and see if we have any concerns or questions that are coming up. And I'll say that Catherine was kind enough to put that question that just disappeared when I changed to this slide. What are the differences you see between affordable rates and assistance programs? She put that into the chat message, so it's in front of you for those of you who want to share thoughts on that. Catherine, anything else, or should I continue on here?
I'm not seeing anything coming in right now, but I would just encourage everyone, as we go. I think we just got one. Let's see, we got a question. Okay, so here's one, Stacey. In the case of affordable rates, what are the funding mechanisms to cover the difference?
Right, that's a good question, and fortunately, we do have a section on the webinar today that deals with how you fund customer assistance programs. And I'll give the punchline. Usually, it's only a couple % of the overall sort of operating budget for the utility that it costs basically to run an assistance program. So it's usually not a huge amount. There are exceptions where there's a lot of, like a high percentage of low-income folks within the customer base, etc. But we will talk about how to fund these things. And we'll talk about, I'll show you a resource to look at the different states, because I know we have people from all across the country on this webinar, and the answer to that question in large part depends on the state that you live in. So, all right, I'll continue here.
We got a few more questions coming in. Let's see. Well, some of these may be better answered later, but let me go ahead and throw them out to you. So let's see. The question is on affordable rates that are built into the rate structure seem a lot more equitable instead of making low-income customers do the extra work to get a discount or assistance when they often don't have the information that would be needed to do this. What about making large commercial users pay more and therefore encouraging conservation for big businesses without hurting low-income customers?
Okay, I think that's two things. I think that's one of the responses here to our question about the difference between affordable rates and assistance programs. So thank you for that thought on that. But then also we get a question in there asking about commercial entities. And this was more covered in webinar 2 of the series, where we talked about pure sort of rate setting in general. And a community can make a decision if economic development is a big concern for the community. And I encourage folks in that last webinar to actually write out what the priorities are for the community. And so again, the Environmental Finance Center has a good tool for that, and I introduced that, where you actually write out and rank the priorities. If economic development is really high on the list, or number 1 of the priorities, then in some cases it makes sense to have the residential customers pay more than their quote-unquote fair share of the cost of service, and somehow in some ways subsidize commercial customers. And I've heard communities say the rationale there is we need jobs in our community. So if we can attract a new employer with a lower water rates than, say, the community next to us, we'll do that. And at least, we'll have a couple more hundred people in our community who not have a paycheck, and so they can pay for their water bill, among other things. So that's kind of the flip side of it. So yeah, it depends on the goals or the priorities of the community and how we use the rate structures to reach some of those goals.
That's great, thank you. One person who just sort of answered the question of what's the difference. Sustainability programs might differ, and the cost of managing, monitoring, implementing them will differ. Also a question of dignity. So good answer. Okay. Why don't we have 1 or 2 more, but Stacey, let's keep going, and then I'm going to keep some of these for later to see if we might cover them as part of your presentation. Okay, great. All right.
So we're going to move into here now, why have a customer assistance program. And just bear with me here, this is being temperamental about moving forward. Yeah, Catherine, I'm not sure if I'm going to have to pass this over to you. It just seems to get
okay, yeah, give it another second. If it doesn't, I can open up your presentation and hold on.
Okay. Yep. Nothing. Okay. Okay, all right. altruistic reasons. So maybe the utility just wants to help folks in this community. Maybe they just care about their customers. But then there's an actual business case for creating an affordability program or a cap. So the utility is more likely to get the next rate increase. So this has been my most powerful tool when it comes to talking with utility staff and managers. There is usually someone on the decision-making team or the governing team, whether it's the county commission board or city council, at least one member of that decision-making team is usually concerned about affordability, right? And so if a utility has an assistance program, it usually allows for that next rate increase. It sort of opens the door. And I will say that a lot of utilities in the country do need to keep raising their rates because there's a backlog of infrastructure that they need to take care of. Sometimes there have been a couple decades or more where we haven't really kept up with the infrastructure, and so there's catching up to do, and so the rates do need to increase. Having a customer assistance program can open the door for that necessary rate increase. But also when customers are having trouble paying their bills, there are actually costs to the utility, including things like increased arrearages, late payments, disconnection notices have to go out, service termination, and so they're actual real costs. And if you lose that customer because they do not pay the bill and continue being a customer, then you don't really recoup on some of these costs. Also, we're seeing that buyers of utility bonds are getting nervous. We are seeing that credit rating agencies for utilities are looking at the level of non-payment and becoming concerned about that. And then maybe public opinion of the utility falls, and it's kind of subjective as to how important that is and how you would even measure that. But I strongly advocate that you start with looking at if there is a problem, right? So maybe the utilities rates are too high. Maybe they're not too high right now overall, but there may be this sector of the customer base for which the rates are unaffordable. And if this sector of the customer base is growing, then it's cause for concern and maybe intervention, right? So we'll look here now at how you measure affordability. Does the utility even have an affordability problem? Some national guidelines, and I use the word guidelines here very purposefully, in that they're not rules of thumb about what is an affordable rate structure and what is not. So there are a couple here that have come out of national publications, etc. And sometimes these numbers are actually misused as 2% of 2% of MHI is good as a anything below that is an affordable rate for wastewater, for instance. And some of the way these numbers were derived, it's not really applicable to use them in the way that they are being used right now. But I will leave that there. And I'll also mention
in household income, right?
Oh yes, MHI stands for median household income. Thanks, Catherine. Okay, so if you are looking at finding some data that answers this question, are the rates affordable? This is an example of a dashboard that the Environmental Finance Center has put together. A lot of work goes into this, but it's an interactive dashboard that you can go and you'll see the bottom right dial is actually a measure of affordability. And there are over 500 water systems in this dashboard for the state of Georgia. And the good news is, if you don't live in Georgia, there's also a chance that there's a dashboard for your state. So there are several dashboards out there, and if you're not one of those states, maybe in the future you will be. So check this. Go back to this website and check to see if your state has a dashboard that includes some sort of affordability measure. But then I wanted to talk about this Excel-based affordability assessment tool. So I'm going to pull up a tool here really quickly, and Catherine will let me know if you guys are not seeing the Excel tool. For now, I will assume that you are. So when this tool is downloadable from the EFC website, it's a free tool. And the first tab really gives you instructions, tells you how to use the tool, okay, and gives you a little teaser on what you can generate from the tool. The second one is where you actually go and put pieces of information in wherever you see a cell in yellow highlight. So I will just try to pull this up right now. So it's pretty detailed. and the tool has been around for a while. When you click on that, you will see you'll see this web page come up, and we have several communities on the webinar today. But I saw Milltown Borough in New Jersey, so I'm going to use them here as a quick example. The next thing that you do, the tool does give you the instructions here about how you do this. It's very important to kind of put in not New Jersey first, but the name of the town. You go to income here, you do selected economic characteristics. Again, the tool walks you through this in the instructions step by step. And then this should start to look familiar. So I'll go back to the tool itself here, and you'll see, you have to record what year of ACS or American Community Survey data you're looking at. You get that from the web page, and then you just fill in the cells here in yellow from the census page that I just showed you. And in a few minutes, usually you can get this type of data. So this is, I have not filled in Milltown's data. Actually, this is data from Flint, Michigan that I had put in several months ago. So you get charts like this. And the key here, we're not going to spend time on it on this webinar, but just take it as I say, that median household income, like Catherine mentioned, percentage median household income has been used as the measure for affordability, but it's been highly criticized. There are lots of downsides to it. And so one of the important things about this tool and why I'm spending some time on it today is that it looks at more than just the median, right? So people who are making less than the median income for a community, they need water services too and wastewater services. So it's important that we not look at, say, just the middle number, the median, but look at the low income folks and what percentage of their bills they're paying on water and or wastewater services. The other thing is that there are other measures out there besides median household income. So this is an income spectrum, again, looking at, so the bars kind of give you the actual, the cost, the percentage of the income that's being spent on water or wastewater services, and then the blue line behind shows you the income spectrum, if you will, for that community. You can put in an alternative rate structure here if the community or the utility is considering a rate increase. They can put that new rate structure in, and this will let you compare, this tool will let you compare the old rate structure and the new rate structure in terms of affordability. And then another cool feature is there's these radio buttons here. You can toggle between all households in the community and homeowners only. I'll just go back here for a second to all households. You see there, when you include like folks in multifamily, apartment complexes, etc., you find that there's a higher percentage of low-income folks, a higher percentage on this lower side of the income spectrum. When we look at homeowners only, we see that this has kind of gone down. So this tool is something that you can play around with. There's even more information here, looking at different measures besides median household income. There are other relevant pieces of data from census, like the percentage of unemployment, the percentage of folks who are receiving SNAP benefits or food stamps, as they used to be called. And of course, this is for Flint, Michigan, so the numbers are a little bit extreme here. But I wanted to give you a quick look at that. If you try to run that tool on your own and you have questions, they're actually they're recorded webinars to show you how to use the tool, etc. So this is what the tool looks like. And sorry, that picture is a little bit blurry. And that's where you can access the tool. Now, there's so much good information on the Environmental Finance Center's website that you probably want to use the search button and just look for affordability assessment tool, and that should bring it up. So if you run the numbers with that assessment tool and you don't like how high some of those bars are, so the community decides that, we do seem to have an affordability problem. Some of those bars, especially on the low income side, are too high. We don't want people paying more than 5% or 7% or 3%, the community really needs to make that decision on what their threshold is for when it comes to affordability. But if we decide that there's an issue and we want to address it, then we have to look at designing a customer assistance program to address the affordability concerns. I'm going to do a quick throwback to webinar 2 here, because remember, rate structure itself, the rate structure itself can help address affordability. There are a couple of things to consider. So a review from webinar 2 is that the fixed charge or the base charge where we put that fixed charge, a fixed charge of $10 versus a fixed charge of $25 obviously has affordability implications. Those variable, well, the big difference in those two different types of rate charges or levels of rate charges. But then some base charges, also include a certain level of consumption. So maybe you have 1,000 or 2,000 gallons, quote unquote, for free with that fixed or base charge every month that low-income customers can benefit from. If we think about the volumetric charge that sits on top of the base or fixed charge, then an increasing block rate helps with conservation, and it can help with affordability, except if there are a lot of large families in your community, then you want to be careful about that. But for block rate structures, we want to look at the differentials between blocks. We want to look at where one block starts and one block ends, right? So if you have to look at the consumption, the average consumption per household for your community, and decide if most people use around 5,000 gallons or less, then putting the first block at 8,000 gallons isn't going to be very effective. And from an affordability perspective, putting the first block at, say, 1,000 gallons is probably going to not help with affordability concerns for your community. So again, if this is sounding like you want to hear more, or it's not quite making sense, take a look at webinar 2, and Catherine has, there's a recording of that you can go back and check out. Okay, so outside of the rate structure, if we look outside of the rate structure to address affordability, this is from a 2010 study by the Water Research Foundation. It's called, they like to have 4-digit codes for all of their research projects, and this one is 4404. And this is just a catalog from that really good affordability research paper on the different types of programs that utilities were saying they have. So everything from education to payment plans, changing in the rate the customer was charged, for instance. So these are some of the options here, or one way of defining the options when it comes to addressing affordability. Deciding if assistance is needed is important, and that's what the affordability assessment helps us do. Deciding who gets that assistance is also really, really important. What types of assistance we provide, like the previous slide gave us some examples. And then it's important to plan for how you're going to really do the outreach so that you reach the right people and get them to subscribe. The subscription process should not be onerous, because that, of course, reduces the level of subscription to the customer assistance program. Determining how much the program may cost is important from the utilities perspective, of course, and we heard someone asking that question earlier. And then having a plan to fund the CAP, the customer assistance program. So in terms of who gets assistance, I like to say this one is a little bit easy, or it can be. It's sort of low-hanging fruit where it's really best practice to partner with another organization in the community that focuses on low-income needs in general. There are existing programs where customers need to prove their eligibility. So LAHEAP, for instance, is the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. It's an energy program, federal energy program. There is no federal water program, but we have food stamps on there as well. Folks who can have proven that they're eligible for Medicaid. All of these can be used to sort of automatically subscribe customers if they're already in one of these programs. So don't reinvent the wheel here, is what we like to say. This concept of a lifeline rate, we talked about a little bit with the base charge and how we design the rate structure, but it's basically, again, from this American Water Works Association M1 manual. It's providing a minimum amount of water at a reduced cost to all customers, regardless of income level or ability to pay. And so I think right in that definition, shows one of the shortcomings, if you will, of this type of approach to addressing affordability is that everybody gets the assistance, right? And like we saw before, often some consumption is included in the base charge. And I have an example here from the state of Alabama from a couple of years ago. And you can see here that for the water utilities in Alabama, out of 465, we have a lot of utilities offering 1 or 2,000 gallons, quote unquote, for free with that base charge. Now, we do have some utilities who do not offer any consumption allowance, right? And it seems like this practice of having a consumption allowance is a little bit more popular in the southeastern part of the country. Again, see webinar 2 in this series for more on this concept. Okay, a little bit on outreach here. So a lot of utilities, or some utilities, have gone through the hurdles of getting a customer assistance program approved by their board or the decision makers. They've actually funded the thing, but sometimes they cannot get the message to the right groups of people. Low-income customers are sort of by definition hard to reach. And so some of the common methods of reaching customers, like bill stuffers and public meetings and community fairs, are important, but there's a great study too on hard to reach by the Water Research Foundation from a couple of years ago, and happy to provide a link to that. I think there's a link actually later on, but it's really important to reach the right customers, and that can be tricky. So this is an example from Denver, Colorado, some of the affordability challenges that we see, and so it breaks down the population there, but I won't spend too much time on that. Okay, and so this came up too. If we are going to have, sorry,
Stacey,
Catherine,
can you go back a second? On hard to reach customers, and so on just to clarify on that slide where it says pay bill or do not pay bill, that's not people who are not paying the bill, but people who don't get a bill because the bill is included in their rent. Is that right?
Yes, that's a good point. So yeah, do not pay, and that's the issue with a lot of hard to reach customers or low income customers. They're tenants, and so they don't receive the water bill directly. And some would say, if we take a step back, some would say that, you know, they're not really customers. If I live in an apartment complex and my water bill is part of my rent to my landlord, then, you know, I'm not technically a water customer of the local utility. But with this research project that I was a subcontractor on through the EFC, it was more important to recognize those folks as sort of indirect customers, because they were still drinking the water from the utility. They were still using the water, right? So if there was a boiled water advisory, we still needed to reach the people who lived in the apartment complex, for instance. So yeah, this is do not pay bill, or means that they don't get a bill directly. But the general consensus from talking with utilities on this study was that we still need to reach those customers. And if we can provide some sort of discount on the bill or lower bill to an apartment complex where we know there are a lot of low income customers, if we can get the landlord to pass that discount on, instead of keeping the rent as it is, then we can help those customers indirectly. But yeah, there's a lot more to dig in here, but that was a good clarification, Catherine. So in terms of funding though, revenue generated directly from the customer rates is really a very important source, and I would say an appropriate source of funding a customer assistance programs. But in some states, it is not an option, and there's that URL for a project that looked at each state, and we'll run through some slides really quickly on that particular concept. Now, you can also have voluntary contributions, so a lot of water and even electric and gas utilities on your bill as a customer, as a residential customer, you'll have the option to round up your bill. Instead of writing your check for $52.12, you can just write it for $53 or $55 or whatever. And that extra money in the roundup goes to help low-income customers. That generally does not, it's a great public education tool, I think, because people see it on their bill and they think, wow, you know, yeah, I guess a lot of folks in this community probably cannot afford a $50-something bill. So yeah, I'll help them. So it's a good public education message or opportunity, but generally bill roundups do not generate a large amount of money, nothing near what a customer assistance program needs to really be robust. Rental income from cell phone. Sometimes cell phone and internet providers will rent space on water utility towers and tanks, and so that's a nice discrete pot of money that's relatively new on the scene, that some utilities feel like it's a good source to use for helping low-income customers. And then this idea of service line protection programs has been ramping up. So here we're talking about the private side. So the line that runs from the meter into the customer's house is really the customer's responsibility. If something should go wrong, though, it could cost hundreds to thousands of dollars for the customer to repair that line, for instance, or replace it. And so these service line protection programs are sort of an insurance program that the customer pays a couple dollars extra on their bill every month, and a third party sort of insurance company will handle the repairs, should repairs be needed on the customer side. And so that's been used in communities like the city of Atlanta to help fund the royalties, I should say. So it's a third party sort of insurer, so that the deal or the contract, if you will, is really between the homeowner and this third party insurer. But the utility, in this case, city of Atlanta, will get some royalties from it. And so the royalties are what they've used. But I will say that first bullet is first, and it's bold for an important reason, in that these other sources that I list here don't generate the kind of money that most utilities need to have a robust customer assistance program. So it's really important to answer that question as to whether their customer rates can be used. And so there's a whole big study on this. It's called Navigating Legal Pathways to Rate-Funded Customer Assistance Programs. So it's basically trying to answer the question, what's legal in your state? So that work was funded a couple of years ago by 7 national water and wastewater associations, and you'll see their logos here. The research team was the Environmental Finance Center at UNC as the prime contractor, with Corona as our subcontractor, and we had 2 independent legal experts that really specialize in affordability of utilities like water, gas, electricity in the country, Scott Rubin and Roger Colton. And basically, this is the cover of the project, of the report that we ended up with. And I show here a screenshot too of the one page. So for each state, as well as Puerto Rico and DC, we have a 2 or 3 page summary of the state laws in that particular state. So I use Alabama just because if you do these alphabetically, Alabama is the first one. And then over here in this blue box, you have some statistics about the state, sort of to put the laws and the rate guidance in context, right? So you can go to this website and you can download just the 2 or 3 page summary for your particular state, or you can download the whole shebang. And there are a couple maps here too that I'll show you. The main finding from this work was that it's confusing and ambiguous in terms of the legal framework for if you can use rate revenue to help some customers. And so in a utility setting world, words like subsidized come up, right? Where basically if you use rate revenue to help low-income customers, it's considered to be a subsidy. So you're taking money or revenues from your high-income customers and subsidizing your low-income customers. And that could be a tricky word in the utility arena. So we found, though, that utilities have to navigate a really complex and confusing legal framework, and it's very different depending on the state. In many cases, there are different types of utilities within the same state have different rules when it comes to can you use rate revenue to help develop a customer assistance program. So California, for example, the government-owned utilities, the customer assistance programs were curbed by restrictive statutory and constitutional provisions, whereas on investor-owned utilities, the caps were really very strongly encouraged, if not required. So depending on which category you felt, a type of utility you were in the state of California, you had sort of different rules governing this question. So again, a lot of states, their statutes didn't even really address this question about can the utility use its primary revenue source, rates, to fund the cap. And where it was addressed, they would say things like rates should be just, rates should be reasonable. So very sort of fuzzy language. And it leaves the utility unsure of what it can do. And we saw many utilities kind of erring on the side of caution and reading words like just and reasonable to mean that they cannot use their rate revenue to fund a CAP program. But again, without the use of rate revenue, most CAPs across the country they really can't address total customer need. So what we did for that work, and this, I'm sorry, this chart got a little messed up here, but we put 4 categories. So yes, you can, it's explicitly authorized in the statutes that you can do this. It's not expressed, so there's a potential for challenge, and then specifically it was prohibited. So we'll look here at how the country broke down, you know, on a state basis. So in each state, just know that there are 2 general types of utilities, most states, I should say. On the one hand, you have some utilities that are governed by the commission or regulated by the commission, and there's some that are not regulated by the commission. And so we had to categorize each of those 2 groups differently in different states. And so you can see where the numbers fell out here. Most of the states were in this middle zone here of no express authority or some potential for challenges. Very few were explicitly clear you can do it, and very few were explicitly clear that you could not do it or specifically prohibited this practice. Just a quick map of, you know, what it looked like. Again, lots of yellows and light greens. And this first slide is the commission regulated ones. This one is the same states, obviously, but the ones that were utilities in those states that were not regulated by the commission. And in both cases, you see the middle sort of gray area is where we found most states falling. Now that said, there are options. So at the state level, we've seen states like Indiana introduce statutory language that cleared it up. Either they say you can say no, or they can say yes. In the case of Indiana, they said that low-income assistance programs should be part of the rate setting process. So they really cleared it up. Washington State was always pretty clear on this as well. A second option, if you haven't gotten there yet with state statutes, is to develop an argument for why the cap does conform to existing And then option 3 is to develop some sort of alternative program that doesn't rely directly on rate revenue. And we pulled together 9 case studies that ran this whole spectrum, right? So there are examples in there of utilities that just, you know, it's really clear that their state won't allow them to use rate revenue and how they've been able to work around that. And then there are examples here from Seattle, where the city of Seattle here, number 8, where it was clear in the statutes that Seattle could do this. So it's an interesting study to look at and probably introduce your water utility local team to this report, and just, you know, it's digestible, and that's just a couple pages per state. And then this is just a sort of an anecdote from the state of Georgia, where the gratuities clause ended up being quite a big concern. Unfortunately, this has not been a concern in most of the other states. Even though each state has some sort of a gift clause, it ended up being a particular problem in Georgia, and bona fide. Like, it's been tested in case law and stuff, and it really does cause a hurdle in Georgia. Yet still, Atlanta, one of our 9 case studies, has funded a CAP for many years. And this just gives you a history. They've been doing it since around 1995. They started with like donations and foundation grants. And sort of big news in 2013, the Atlanta Code. So they worked on the city code as well. They amended it to allow water and waste and sewer revenues to be used to fund their Care and Conserve program. Care and Conserve is the name of their assistance program. And then in 2016, they approved $1 million of rate revenue to actually be used. So that was pretty significant.
Hey, Stacey, so that's interesting. So, because here with Atlanta, you're saying that the city actually changed their code as opposed to what we were looking at previously, which was changes like in Indiana to state law. So can the change be made in any place, or if you have a state that's prohibitive, you'd have to change it at the state law and the city, or how do you see that? Like, where would groups put their efforts if you're trying to make some changes to the way that operations work?
Well, I think a two-pronged approach would be great, right? So if you can lobby or advocate or talk to people at the state level to get them to focus on this, get this issue on their radar and have them clarify statutes, that's always sort of golden. That's where we want to reach for, that really clarifies things, but that can be a slower process. So at the same time, I would encourage utilities to look at their own like charter or code. Now, what really determines the answer to your question, Catherine, is the level of home rule in a state. So you might have heard that term home rule, and unfortunately, home rule turned out to be a term of art. You know what you mean by home rule in New Mexico is probably not what we mean in North Carolina, and probably, definitely people in the same state have different connotations of what home rule means. But generally, home rule refers to the level of autonomy that's given to the local government. So some states really control things at the state level, and the cities, municipalities, counties don't have as much flexibility. So we say that that's not a home rule state. And then you have states where the state government does not control as much, and they pass along, or they allow the local governments to have more say and more control. And that we'll say that's a home rule state. So I would say Georgia is, home rule state. And so, but then, Atlanta is a little bit of an anomaly too. It's such a big city within the state of Georgia that they really set precedents. And so, yeah, they were able to work with some affordability consultants to change their own codes, where they said, that in terms of the business case, basically they made the business case and showed that actually having a customer assistance program and funding it with rate revenue saved the utility money in the long run. And so that's one of the changes that they made to their code. So that's a long answer to your question, Catherine. And the short answer is it depends, but I hope that I gave some information there.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Let's see if and when the slide. Okay, there we go. So here's a more specific example, right? The purely charitable purposes kind of is a nod to this gift clause or gratuities clause that I was mentioning before, and this is one of the changes that the city code that Atlanta made to the city code to kind of open the door for these changes. So it's something that local governments could consider. And if you are advocating for water conservation and helping low-income customers, you should, be able to tell the utility staff that other cities have changed their code, for instance. Okay, looking at the time here, we're moving in just to now a couple other recent resources on designing CAPs. But before I do that, Catherine, I can pause here to see if we have specific questions you want to raise at this point.
Yeah, so let me give you one that came in actually a little bit earlier that might be. So I think, obviously we've been talking about focusing on drinking water rates, but there's a question of, you have rates for wastewater and potentially stormwater, and so how do you pay all of them? And so a question who came in was owners of parking lots and big box stores who aren't paying into the water system because the city doesn't have a stormwater rate proportionate to the amount of stormwater created off the property. Like, what are there ways to address that?
Okay, so yeah, that's a good question. So I think it's saying that you have commercial entities with parking lots that are creating water quality issues from runoff, but more on the stormwater side. Yeah, I think the short answer to that is to work towards developing a stormwater utility fee. I'm a big advocate that that's a great way to develop a predictable, reliable funding source for water quality projects, is to have some sort of stormwater utility. But that's a long-term goal, I realize. And it is tricky when you have these folks that, are not paying into the system that way. But the ultimate best practice would be to work towards developing a stormwater utility.
Right, and so affordability, I mean, is there a way does the dashboard, for example, that you showed everyone, does that take into account wastewater, like all water rates, or is it just focus on drinking water?
No, the dashboards usually have both. What you can look at water separately, so there are radio buttons. You can look at water only, you can look at wastewater only, and then you can look at water and wastewater combined, usually. And then the assessment tool, the affordability assessment tool that I showed, you can look at water only, wastewater only, or you can combine them as well in that tool. And of course, you know, folks on the webinar probably know this already. Wastewater tends to cost more than treating water. So yeah, it's a really important consideration when we look at affordability. And we're seeing a lot of the more recent reports that a couple I'm not even going to mention here today, but there is this nod to sort of the holistic or the one water approach where, you know, as utilities as communities adopt stormwater utilities, which I, you know, recommend as a best practice, as they do that, the overall cost of water is going up, and we shouldn't look at these things in isolation, right? Ideally, when they calculate new methods of affordability, for instance, or measuring affordability, they are mentioning that we should consider stormwater in there as well. Should I move on, Catherine, or do you have another question?
Yeah, I'll let you know some more questions. Thanks.
Okay, great. All right, so we have a couple resources here that I wanted to mention. Of course, we've mentioned two already, at least, but the EPA put out this compendium. If these reports have like a one word nickname, I should say, this one is commonly just referred to as the compendium, but it looks at nationally different customer assistance programs. And so it's broken out by states as well. And it was funded by this center, the Water Infrastructure Resilience and Finance Center, through EPA, that's really only been around for a few years. They're also the folks that run the WIFIA program, which is a new big loan program for water infrastructure. And so they do some innovative things. And this was I think one of their first reports, that maybe the first big report that they put out. It was a compilation from sort of a web search. So I know, for instance, the City of Atlanta's Care and Conserve program is not covered in the report, but it is pretty comprehensive. It does look across the country and looks at, in each state, you know, the different types of customer assistance programs that are being offered by utilities. So that's one place that you can look for examples. Maybe your city or your county doesn't have a customer assistance program, but your decision makers or utility staff may be interested in hearing about communities close by or within your state that do. And this would be a good place to sort of a catalog. If you can find examples there, and then you can go to their websites or whatever and try to find more details on those programs. So that's a good one. And then I've mentioned the M1 manual before by AWWA, the American Water Works Association. They recently put out the 7th edition of this manual, and the manual itself is called, you know, Principles of Water Rates, Fees, and Charges. They only updated certain chapters of the M1 manual this last time, and affordability was definitely one that got a big rework. So we spent a lot of time rewriting that particular chapter, extending it, adding a lot of information. So that's a good resource as well. It's not as recent anymore. It came up before too, like how much does a customer assistance program cost? If you are going to talk to your utility staff and advocate for one of these programs, they'll probably want to know how much it's going to cost. And so there is another Excel-based tool that I wanted to highlight here. I'm not going to actually pull up the tool and go through it, but a rule of thumb that I've heard from experts in the field is that 1 or 2% of total user charge revenues is what it really takes to run the average customer assistance program. But this Excel tool was developed again by the Environmental Finance Center at UNC through a Water Research Foundation grant, and you can access it through this link. And I will say too, a lot of the Water Research Foundation stuff is behind a paywall. You cannot access them unless you're a paid member of the Water Research Foundation or a subscriber. But this is one of the things that you should be able to access without a paid subscription. So you should take advantage of that, or at least introduce the utility staff to this resource. So it lets the utility, or the, if it's you playing around with the tool, like, do you want to give a discount? How much? And you put in information like that, and then it kind of gives you the cost of the program that you're designing in Excel. All right, so quickly to recap here, instead of going through the outline slide, I thought this was a better way to do it, reviewing that process slide or the flow chart, right? Is there an affordability problem? If not now, then fine. Maybe we can put it a little bit lower down the list of priorities, but keep watching it, like run the assessment tool at least once a year, or every time that there's been a rate increase at least. But if we do find that there is an issue, then what we tried to do today was look at ways to design a customer assistance program and look at the different factors that we need to consider, like how you fund it, how you do the outreach, figuring out who gets the assistance, and then just basically what type of assistance we want to provide to the low-income customers. All right, Catherine, we have another poll here. So I'm wondering, what do you think will be the most challenging part of a customer assistance program in your community, or the community that you have in mind that you're trying to work with right now? So you have several options there.
Yeah, the poll should be up and out. Hopefully you can see it. So go ahead and select one answer. This is a great question. And I think, there's a lot of times, Stacey, local groups probably haven't been involved in this process, but there's a great opportunity, an important opportunity to ask some of these questions and be a part of it.
Yeah, and I will ask you, Catherine, since as a panelist, I don't see the actual poll. Were you able to put all 5 choices on there, so A to E, or did GoToWebinar limit it to 4?
5 choices on here, and
okay.
So
great.
What do you think the challenging part will be in your community? And so of people who have voted so far, we're still waiting for some votes to come in, but it looks like right now about 40% think that funding the customer assistance program will be the most tricky part. Okay. That's followed by 30% the eligibility, deciding who actually should get assistance, and then 20% deciding whether there is an affordability, if there is or should be an affordability program. And then a few on outreach. So that's kind of where it looks like things are landing right now.
Okay, all right. Well, that's interesting. I would say, from the resources you saw today, deciding if there's an affordability program, if we're willing to use data and not, just people's feelings or that kind of thing, then that question hopefully is easier to answer from the webinar today. Funding is always tricky, but hopefully you also got some ideas. And again, if there's a big, if the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation comes to your city or your county and says, we will give you X million dollars for a customer assistance program, then one, you're the luckiest community in the world, probably, right? But that's pretty unlikely. However, if that did happen, you wouldn't have some of the restraints that we have when we look at using customer revenue. But I think it's worth the battle to kind of clarify, getting permission, if you will, to use the rate revenue, because all sort of grown-up projects, all real, actual, bona fide projects out of water utility or wastewater utility or stormwater utility are really funded through the rate revenue. That's the way it's supposed to be. That's the enterprise business model for local government utilities. And so this affordability challenge, as it continues to grow, and we see, I didn't have slides on this today, but we see water and wastewater rates outstripping the cost of living. The inflation that we've been seeing over the last several years, water and sewer rates are increasing twice as fast as that. So there will be a problem in the future with affordability for water and sewer if there isn't one now. And another thing to mention too here, that we didn't cover through the slides is that some folks like to say, and water utility folks like to say this a lot, you know, water is still cheap compared to electricity, for instance. You know, we don't have an affordability problem. We don't have to worry about that. We have other things to focus on. But people with fixed incomes and fixed budgets, low income folks, they already have their medical bills and their food bills and maybe their housing bills, that they don't have as much wiggle room. So when water rates or wastewater rates are increasing so sharply, it does cause a strain on those really tight budgets, even though that has been a smaller percentage of the total budget in the past. So anyway, all right, well, thanks for your input on that question. And I will move the slides here. So I think this is the last slide that I had anyway, Catherine. And so we can check in with you on any further questions.
Yeah, and so yeah, Stacey, thank you so much. And so let me see, are there other questions for Stacey? And I want to remind everyone that everyone who's on today, you're going to get a follow-up email from me later today inviting you to office hours with Stacey, which happens this Thursday. And so that's a chance to have an hour just to ask questions and discuss maybe your specific community in a way you can't really do in a webinar like this. So look for that email later. But in the meantime, are there any questions for Stacey you'd like to put in the chat box before we leave for the day? So here's a question. Are the quickly increasing water rates mainly due to old, outdated, and failing infrastructure?
Yeah, I would say yes. And you know, we can't put it off anymore because things are really breaking now. So we have to address it. But the regulations is another big part of it, right? So we have emerging contaminants that we weren't even testing before, like the PFAS, PFAS group of compounds, for instance. And so regulations from EPA are becoming, as a utility would probably put it, more onerous. And so that's driving the cost of treatment up and also increasing the cost of water. So I'd say those are the two big things, the two big drivers.
Right. Another question, Stacey, is the analysis that you went through with the states, looking at that, does that apply to both customer assistance programs and an approach like Philadelphia's, which is a sort of proactive, affordable rate?
Not exactly. So Philadelphia was just getting into designing and setting up their program when we did that study. And it was one of those cases that as a researcher, I was really trying to figure out what was happening with Philadelphia and have 10 case studies instead of 9. But it was a little bit early in their process. And so they did not make it into the study as a case study. However, I know, and this is a good place to mention this, for example, the Indiana statute change happened after that report was published, that Pathways report, but I know that the Environmental Finance Center has tried to go back in and update the state summaries, right? So the report actually has 3 main components. One is a nice introduction, sort of laying out the issues, so that would be the 4 components. And then the bulk of it is really these 2 or 3 page state summaries, and then the 9 case studies. But then there's also a section that I haven't mentioned, a couple sections that look at a couple different countries. So internationally, what the US water sector and wastewater sector may gain from countries like Spain, England and Wales, for instance. And then we also looked at 2 other industries. So we looked at electricity and we looked at telecommunications. Telecommunications might seem like a strange pick, but really that industry, think about landlines at people's homes, and now cell phones with data, etc. That industry has experienced a lot of change. And so the assistance program at the federal level has had to keep up with that. So the water industry also has had some changes. So we did go back in while I was still at the Environmental Finance Center and update the Pennsylvania chapter to include a little bit on Philadelphia, I believe. But it was not front and center when we were looking at each state. Like, we weren't saying, can Maine, the state of Maine, do what Philadelphia has done, because the processes were unfortunately happening a little too concurrently. So they were in parallel, and we didn't really fold that into every state.
Great. So there's a bunch of, both hurdles and opportunities for communities and states that would like to address affordability, and there are different options for how to do so. I think, the main bottom line you were saying today, and there's a lot of tools out there to help communities figure it out.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts, Stacey, before we close out, just in closing comments for everyone?
Well, I was going to mention, I believe, Catherine, that the first set of office hours will focus mainly on affordability, and that's coming up really soon. I think it's this Thursday, August 1st, if I'm not mistaken. So just kind of wanted folks to be, well, that's on your slide right now. So yeah, it is next month, but next month is very soon. So get on that bandwagon earlier.
Yeah, it totally is. So yeah, so just to close that thought, we have one more webinar in this series with Stacey on green infrastructure, so that you can register for that on our link here. The office hours of Stacey, 2 times you can come and talk to her and really dig in on questions in your community. Again, I'll send out an email to participants later today with how to sign up and the call-in information for that. And then I also have, you'll see in the follow-up email, a link to the recording of this webinar. It will go on our YouTube channel later. You'll also get a link to an evaluation, which I also put in the chat box. And to the extent you're able to fill that out, it's super short. It takes probably 30 seconds to fill out. Definitely helps us to try to figure out how to do a better job with these. So with that, I really want to thank everyone for joining us, and thank Stacey for being a great presenter on a really sort of dense topic. You can tell there's even more to unpack, so I hope you'll join her on the office hours if that's something you'd be interested in doing. So thank you, Stacey, and thank you to all our participants today, and we look forward to seeing you either at office hours or at an upcoming webinar. So thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Great. Thanks, Catherine.